My name is Elizabeth Hansberg. I'm the Director of People for Housing Orange County. We are the Yes in My Backyard organization for Orange County. And we are excited today to host Professor Ken Stahl from Chapman University Law School and his colleague, Professor Kristina Currans at the Urban Planning Program at the University of Arizona to talk about traffic studies and why they are a barrier to housing. And if you are looking for the nexus for why a housing advocacy organization is talking about overestimated traffic counts,
Better?
the reason is because NIMBYs love a traffic study that makes new housing look like a burden on the people that are currently living in the proximity of the new development. And they will pull out said traffic study at the podium when they're at the public hearing, making public comment, and wave it around and say, this is why we can't have this development because of look at all this traffic that's going to happen, right? Not really thinking in context about the fact that a lot of those people are already driving in the area because they're commuting in. So that's the nexus between why I'm excited, between what our work is in advocating for more housing in Orange County and this study. So I want to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Ken, who's going to give the first part of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, and thanks to everybody for being here. Christy and I are really excited to share this work with you and to get some of your feedback. Just for the sake of simplicity, Christy and I decided that I would do the sort of opening presentation for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then open up the floor for your comments and questions, because that's really what we think would be useful is to get your feedback, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Let me just jump right in so I have a few slides. I don't usually love to do a lot of text on slides. I find that they're very dense, so I won't be reading through each slide's texts, but at least for this one, because this is the overview, I'm going to go through it a little bit point by point, and then after that, it'll be a little bit more breezy, because I know nobody likes PowerPoints with lots of text. So the bottom line or the overview is that what we're going to talk about is traffic and parking studies. We're mostly going to talk about traffic studies, and the related concept of trip generation are enormously important parts of the land use decision-making process in cities across the country, especially in California, and other types of municipal decisions like municipal financing decisions. And they affect our lives in all kinds of different ways that most people, unless they're in the real estate planning and development industries, don't really know about. The reason why these traffic studies and the underlying trip generation method are so significant is they're extremely widely used throughout the land use development process. And at the same time that they're extremely widely used and widespread, it's also widely known by people who use them, people who study them, that traffic studies and trip generation are very unreliable in a number of different ways. But one of the most significant ways is they almost always tend to overestimate traffic and parking demand, if you're talking about a traffic study versus a parking study. And the result of that, practically, is number one, it perpetuates an auto-dominant society in which we always need more parking and more roads to accommodate more cars, and then the more parking and the more roads actually induce the demand for more cars and more parking. The second is, as Liz alluded to in her opening, because traffic studies tend to overestimate demand, they give ammunition to project opponents to try to block development by conjuring up nightmare scenarios of how much traffic a project is going to bring in. And then relatedly, even where a project is approved, despite the nightmare scenarios of traffic and parking demand, traffic studies raise costs for developers, which are ultimately in many ways passed on to consumers, because developers then have to accommodate all this traffic that's been predicted. So these are kind of the consequences that flow from traffic studies that tend to overestimate demand. And it is widely known, as I've said, in the planning world, in the traffic engineering world, but it's rarely discussed, certainly in the legal circles where I tend to travel. And it is also proven very difficult to reform. For a lot of reasons, all the different players in the system are stuck with the status quo. And that's a really important point I want to come back to. And that's particularly where I want to solicit your feedback on ways we can break that status quo. One way, at least, our thought, and certainly mine as a lawyer, is how we can use the law to advance the ball in this area. And certainly based on our research, the law seems to require something more than totally unreliable methods for predicting traffic impacts. And in fact, something that just occurred about a month or so ago, or actually 2 months, could be an enormous game changer. The Supreme Court of the United States agreed to take the case of Sheets versus County of El Dorado, a case from California, that is going to require cities to perform nexus and proportionality studies under the Supreme Court's exactions jurisprudence in a much wider array of decisions. And that's going to cause municipalities to have to really think about the validity of the methods that they're using to determine traffic impacts. Now, with that said, one of the big problems that we have, and where I really want to focus our time, is on what happens in the world after. If we succeed in throwing out this status quo that everybody agrees is bad, what do we replace it with? If we get rid of the conventional method, it could increase denials, could increase uncertainty, could increase litigation. So we don't want a world of lots of bad unintended consequences to replace a status quo that nobody likes. And so maybe that means we are married to the status quo. So the question I'll have for you is really, how do you think we can move forward, especially those of you who've dealt with traffic studies in your daily lives and careers? I'm going to skip through this one. So let me just start saying a little bit about trip generation and traffic studies and some of the critiques. I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly. So typically, let's say, for example, you have a project and it's going to be, say a 10,000 square foot shopping center, right? How do we predict how much traffic this shopping center is going to generate? Well, typically cities will use a method for predicting the number of trips that's created by this nonprofit organization called the Institute of Transportation Engineers, or ITE. ITE publishes standard trip generation rates for every type of land use. You can see here ITE's trip rates for a shopping center are 3.71 trips for every 1,000 square feet of gross leasable area. So if you've got a 10,000 square foot shopping center, you would essentially, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but multiply 3.71 trips by, in this example, 10, right? So 37 trips per day generated by the shopping center. So it's pretty simple arithmetic. That's basically the way that these traffic studies are done, using the ITE trip generation rates. For parking, it's somewhat different, but similar here. You can see what the parking generation looked like for a fast food restaurant with drive-in windows, right? A daily rate of 9.95 trips. Okay, so that's really a quick overview of how trip generation works and how trip generation is used in a traffic study to generate predictions about how much traffic a project is going to generate. Now, this process of predicting traffic using ITE has become extraordinarily pervasive. How pervasive, you can see here. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can read it in the paper, which I think which we'll make available on the People for Housing website. These are all just examples that we came up with of different types of land use decisions where trip generation is used. And so you can see that it's absolutely pervasive in almost everything that municipalities do. Why is it so pervasive? Well, there's two reasons, one political and one legal. The political reason is traffic is a hot button political issue at the local level, as many of you probably know, and it increases whenever there is economic prosperity and in places that have economic prosperity and population growth. And so residents are always demanding that local elected officials do something about traffic. And so you end up with situations like this. I snapped this from where I used to live in Irvine. A voter initiative to overturn a rezoning approved by the Irvine City Council. And you can see what was ultimately a successful campaign slogan here. 10,000 more cars, no way, right? Obviously, this was designed and successfully frightened the voters of Irvine into rejecting the rezoning with the fears of 10,000 new cars on the road. Where did they get 10,000 new cars from? Presumably from the traffic study generated by the project that showed 10,000 cars. So for political reasons, it is necessary to do these sorts of traffic studies. It's also necessary for legal reasons because courts, as we'll talk about, increasingly require that municipal decisions based on traffic concerns have to have some kind of empirical evidence supporting them. And so that has led municipalities increasingly to rely on traffic studies to empirically predict the level of traffic that the project is going to generate. Now, the problem is, as we alluded to, there's a lot of flaws in this method, okay? Foundationally, as you can see here, the trip generation rates are based on extraordinarily small number of samples, right? The graph here even says, caution, use carefully. We don't have a lot of samples. Yet these numbers are usually just used, willy-nilly without any adjustment based on the caution to be careful. You can also see here, there is absolutely no relationship between the actual square footage of the shopping center or of the drive-in restaurant and the traffic and the parking demand, right? There's just no relationship at all. Also, the data tends to be really old, many of it dating back from the 80s, and is almost entirely taken from suburban sites where there's lots of where there's not transit and a lot of free parking. So it doesn't take account for differences in context. Like if this were an urban restaurant where it's maybe near a train station or near a bike path, as opposed to in a suburban area where there isn't any infrastructure for different transportation modes. In addition, there are a number of sort of theoretical problems with the ITE method, as it's called, or the conventional method for trip generation. There is an assumption that land uses generate trips when, of course, land uses don't generate trips. People demand activities, and it's from that demand that land uses are generated. So if there's a demand for housing, if there's a demand for a movie theater, that's because people want to go to the movies or because there's a demand for labor from an employer. And it's not the land use that is the cause. And so what this means ultimately is that if a developer has to pay to mitigate the traffic that they're generating, what they're paying for is actually something that benefits the public as a whole, but the public as a whole isn't paying. Only the developer and the ultimate housing consumer are paying. Second, conventional traffic studies, or TIAs, traffic impact analyses, assume that all vehicle demand has to be accommodated. And so in other words, developers have to mitigate the traffic that they're going to be generating with lane widening or additional free parking, which, as I said earlier, induces the very traffic it predicts, creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and this sort of perpetual motion machine where traffic always gets worse. And then finally, the ITE method assumes that all trips are new, whereas many trips are diverted from existing places. And that, again, tends to overestimate the amount of traffic that will be generated by a particular land use. So all of these critiques indicate that the ITE method tends to err in the direction of estimating too much traffic. Okay, so how do we kind of address this problem? Well, I think it's pretty clear that traffic studies are the kind of junk science that courts typically reject in most other contexts. But courts haven't rejected the ITE method. In fact, they've tended to defer to it and claim that it's the industry standard. This is kind of ironic because the reason ITE is the industry standard is because planners and traffic engineers know that courts will accept it. And courts will accept it because traffic engineers and planners use it. So it's totally circular, despite the fact that planners and traffic engineers themselves often bemoan how unreliable the method is, but they're stuck with it. So there's this sort of circularity that marries all the different players to a status quo that they know isn't working. So again, how do we break it? Well, as we argue, although the courts have very rarely taken on the ITE method directly, there is a large body of judicial precedent holding that courts should be, and increasingly are, more skeptical of empirically unsupported traffic predictions. Now, here's the part I'm going to go a little bit quickly through because I don't want to get bogged down in all the legal niceties. But one thing that we're doing in the paper is just showing that although in theory, courts tend to review municipal land use decisions very deferentially, there is a trend of them being more skeptical of empirically unsupported traffic predictions. You could see some of those here in this slide. And I think what's really going to supercharge this, as I indicated earlier, is the Sheets versus County of El Dorado case. Traditionally, courts, especially in California, had always said, well, this idea that if a municipality wants to do an exaction where they demand some kind of monetary payment or dedication of land in exchange for an approval, that's what we call an exaction. Exactions typically require that there be some showing of a nexus between the demand and the impact of the development and rough proportionality. But the California courts have always said that only applies if it's like an individualized determination, not if it's a broad prospective policy decision. It looks like the Supreme Court of the United States is going to change that and say that the nexus and rough proportionality test applies regardless of what type of decision it is, anytime there's an exaction. And that means that in a large variety of these what are called legislative contexts, enactment of a general plan, a zoning ordinance, voter ballot box initiative, that were traditionally considered legislative and therefore did not have to show the nexus and proportionality, they're now going to have to show that. And by the way, not coincidentally, the Sheets case involves a traffic study that used the ITE conventional trip method. So things are coming to a head. And to summarize where we've been so far and then go to what I really want to ask you about, we know that traffic studies and trip generation are not reliable, although I'd love to hear your feedback if you think they actually are reliable. I haven't heard any argument that they are. They do not appear to satisfy any judicial standard of review, and the law is moving in the direction of demanding more from traffic studies and trip generation. The problem, though, is there can be some unintended consequences if we do this. Note that, by the way, none of these objections I'm going to describe actually try to defend the ITE. They're just saying, well, we could replace ITE with something worse, right? That is possible. So let me talk about some of these objections and see what your responses are. One is, and this is really more for the lawyers, courts are not really equipped to second guess a methodology. Courts aren't experts in traffic studies. And if they really demand more of traffic studies, how are they going to know what's a reliable study and what's not? What's a reliable method and what's not? And our response to that, I think, in brief is, well, if the courts aren't going to apply any scrutiny to an obviously unreliable method, then what are they even doing? I mean, is there any scrutiny being applied to municipal land use decisions at all? I understand that these decisions are deferential, but deference doesn't mean abdication. There has to be some line, and if the evidence that's being used is totally unreliable, it shouldn't be used. And the courts, again, seem to be agreeing with that idea. Also, we certainly recognize that courts have significant limitations because of their lack of expertise and just the nature of the judicial process. State legislatures and departments of transportation need to be stepping into the breach and doing more to give guidance to courts and guidance to local planning agencies about what will be considered acceptable methods in place of ITE. And we've given some examples here. The second objection is, if we're right, will it become impossible to finance municipal services because it will be so hard for municipalities to use exactions? And of course, in states like California, using the property tax and other types of revenue-raising devices is already extremely difficult. Well, again, this is something the Supreme Court itself is demanding, that you cannot dump the cost of financing municipal services onto developers and ultimately onto housing consumers unless you have a nexus and proportionality, because otherwise you're unfairly asking one group of people to bear a burden that should be borne by the public as a whole. Again, this seems like an area where agencies need to be putting resources into developing better methods. But I don't think this is a defense to throwing out the ITE method when the Supreme Court itself is making clear that it's demanding more. The third, and I think this is getting into what the objections that really start to make me sweat a little bit. is that it's possible projects will be denied more frequently without the ITE. Because if cities cannot predict traffic impacts, if there is no reliable way of doing that, and they can't demand exactions to mitigate traffic impacts, and they've got a room full of angry neighbors saying, we don't want this project that's too much traffic, they may be pressured to deny a project. Now, our response here is under existing precedents, we've researched this quite a bit. Projects are not supposed to be denied based on traffic fears without reliable supporting evidence, and courts have overturned project denials where it was based on unsupported traffic fears. So it's true, courts may have to be policing municipal actions a little bit more than they have customarily done, but that itself also seems to be the trend in states like California, where we now have the Housing Accountability Act. Courts are being called upon to more aggressively scrutinize what municipalities are doing. So that may be what courts have to do, and the legislature may again have to step in to kind of give guidance to the courts or to sort of push them to be more assertive in striking down municipal actions. But this is definitely something that we're a little bit concerned about and curious to see what you think. And then finally, I think there's a status quo bias. In order for ITE to really get challenged in court, somebody has to sue to have it invalidated. And traditionally, developers don't like suing cities because relationships matter. And you certainly don't want to spend a lot of money on an uncertain outcome, and litigation is always an uncertain outcome, especially when you're kind of moving the law in a new direction, which is kind of what we're advocating. So for this to work, developers would really have to be persuaded that there are significant cost savings if they can move from ITE to some other method that doesn't overestimate traffic. We're also seeing in California a lot of, at least anecdotally, evidence that developers, especially with new state housing laws, are becoming more assertive in dealing with municipalities. And so maybe, and again, it only takes one to set a precedent, there will be a developer who wants to take on this method and prove that it's unreliable. And if they create a precedent, that can work to the benefit of everyone. Potentially, there could also be broader statutory standing for nonprofit housing organizations. This is something the Housing Accountability Act has also done, allowing nonprofit housing organizations to sue to overturn a municipal denial of a project. Maybe housing organizations or transportation advocacy groups should have standing to go to court and sue over unreliable methods for predicting traffic impacts. So these are some of our ideas, and you can see some of these, by the way, in our previous published paper in the Journal of the American Planning Association. Here's a link, and the slides should be published on the People for Housing webpage. And if you have any questions, you should feel free to email myself or Christy, ideally both of us. And we would be delighted to get your feedback either now or later. With that, I'll turn it back over to Liz to moderate the conversation, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Ken. We didn't have any questions come through yet. At one point, I think there was a glitch and we lost the view of your slides, and so I think but it came back. So I guess since we're not a huge group, and this is set up as a meeting, if there's anybody, if you want to type your question into the chat, or if you even want to unmute yourself and come off mute, we are recording it, so just be aware of that. But yeah, would love to facilitate a conversation around what you've heard here, how it relates to what you're working on.
Liz, just to clarify, I muted the slides intentionally just for a minute because it wasn't relevant to what I was saying, and I didn't want it to be a distraction.
Oh, okay. Well,
all right, I have a question.
Okay, good. Thank you for rescuing us from the
All
silence.
right. So I note, I'm going to use an example of a, let's see, what's the name of the place? And now the name escapes me. So when you do a commercial establishment, I know some shopping centers have extra parking spaces. And then when they change their use to, let's say, a drive-through hamburger chain, suddenly there's not enough parking spaces and the backup is through the shopping center and into the road. So just doing the shopping center based on the square footage of the shopping center doesn't seem like a good way to estimate it. I assume we're averaging existing shopping centers, and that's how this initial data came about, is that we're going from the initial, so some shopping centers, and then you average those and say, okay, this is how many parking spaces you need for this many square footage. But there's such a difference in a Starbucks, and this is another example. You take a Starbucks and the drive-through, and they overwhelm a shopping center, and a lot more parking is required for that. Well, that has nothing to do with the initial, you're building a 50,000 square foot shopping center and you need this many parking spaces. And on the residential end, since I'll give you kind of plenty to do, I noted on the latest number of new apartment complexes being built in Carlsbad Village, all the developers that do not have street parking nearby are putting more parking spaces than required by the city on site to accommodate their customers because they know they have to have that. And I'd like your opinion on what you think of those.
Well, so two different elements there, and I think maybe we could take a step back, I think, and think about some of the fundamental issues with TIAs, traffic studies of the like. First of all, I think we conflate traditional studies or conventional studies, which are very vehicle oriented and suburban oriented, with the types of innovations that Ken was talking about. When you're taking what is historically very, very suburban vehicle oriented data and you're applying it in an urban setting, you often are oversupplying those things, which adds to the cost, but it also creates lots of challenges with the built environment. I think some of what you're talking about is where these methods can be so rough and not necessarily reflect the activities that are happening on the types of developments coming in. You know, we're trying to average them, but Starbucks is not like other types of coffee shops or other similar types of shops. So in those contexts, we're not introducing nuance into the method, into the types of activities we anticipate, and we're not considering how that site functions as part of a larger neighborhood. I don't think there are any methods that really do well capturing all of the issues we have with trying to deal with this problem. And I think the areas that I've seen that tend to do that well, it becomes more of a relationship and a discussion to figure out what makes sense, not just for the site, but for the land uses, for the neighborhood, for the types of uses on the site. So not a hard answer there. Ken, what do you think?
No, this is way outside my expertise, so I'll defer to you. But that sounds like the right answer to me. I was just going to say I'd appreciate it if folks were willing to, if you could just tell us what your background is, because I'd be very curious to know, especially among those who are commenting, if you're a planner, if you're an engineer, or a developer, something else, just so we have a sense of because my sense is that the different people coming from different areas might have different perspectives on this. So that's something I'd be curious about. But no, I don't have anything to add.
Eric, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hey, how you guys doing? Good to see you. Couple things. Well, I have just a simple comment, which is, this idea that traffic studies ultimately mean limited or no impact with mitigation, yet traffic exists. It doesn't get better. Tends to not they don't appear to be accurate in the sense that, if traffic studies have worked and are true science, why do we have traffic? I guess would be my first question. But, being that traffic is elastic and, I think I don't disagree with this notion that the studies themselves are questionable. I guess where I want to maybe lead the conversation or ask some questions relate to the nuances between our new requirements of VMT analysis under CEQA. And let me stop there. I'm a developer. I build homes throughout the Southern California region, and quite often run into challenges with both traffic analysis and VMT analysis. And now we're running into huge issues where we have these VMT analysis under CEQA, and then we have traffic analysis under the city's, planning review. So they have conditions of approval that are not related to CEQA. And then I have mitigation requirements under VMT, which tend to counteract the whole idea of why we don't do traffic studies anymore. We still have to do it under the general plan consistency. So I guess love to get some more insights into how you see, things moving forward. In multiple cases, I've had to move away from simple MNDs on projects that I could theoretically mitigate my traffic, but because I cannot mitigate my VMT impacts, I'm now required to seek a EIR with overrides, which creates just more problems and a lot more time and delays and potential denials.
Well, so two questions there. The first is largely that I think part of the problem with assuming traffic studies are supposed to resolve traffic is because we're looking at a site, we're not looking at a whole area, and traffic is not the land use does not generate the traffic, the people do, and the people are demanding activities and moving across a whole city. So it really becomes more a question of sort of the city level or the regional level planning. But I would also say that not all traffic is bad. I think we inherently think it is because there's vehicle delay, but to some degree, in economic studies, there's some indications that some traffic, maybe not a ton, is associated with more economic activity, correlated with more economic activity as well. But I don't think it's fair to assume that a traffic study should have to be the thing that resolves traffic, in part because it's looking at a site and maybe a small scope of area. And then in terms of the VMT, for those who maybe aren't familiar with the difference, traffic studies are really meant to cover adjacent problems. So the local signal, the size of the facility, so on. VMT is meant to cover sort of the impact on the amount of use associated with greenhouse gas emissions. It's meant to be more of a regional scale model. In some, but not all of the models used to estimate VMT at a site level, you're still using a lot of the same data, you're just applying additional assumptions. And to some degree, that could be good because it captures more of the trip length. So if you put in a restaurant, your restaurant is local serving versus regional serving, theoretically, you could capture more of that local traffic and recognize that people aren't coming across a region to get to you. They're coming from their local neighborhood and possibly walking more, biking more, so on. So there are different scales there. In terms of the bureaucracy of the two different methods and how they do or don't talk to one another, that I think is a much bigger challenge. And I go back and forth, I think the move to VMT is possibly a better move in terms of managing traffic. The smaller scale stuff and the vehicle trips, I think, is just sort of, it gives a myopic view of what a land use's impacts are. But a lot of the underlying methods for traffic studies are also trying to think about, at the very least, safety as well, and sort of connecting to the highway capacity manual. So I don't have an easy answer for that either, because I think that's also bureaucracy of like trying to evaluate two different things at two different scales.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's the move to VMT, like Christy says, is designed to move us away from a world where everything is being done on a site-specific basis to a more system-wide basis. But the CEQA is stuck in the universe where your project is evaluated on a project-by-project basis, and you have to mitigate your project's impacts, which is impossible to do when VMT is not looking at project impacts; it's looking at region-wide impacts.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure I'm not going to lose any fans saying that CEQA, of course, is kind of the bigger issue that's looming here, right? And everything you're saying, Eric, about needing to do an EIR is the case, and widespread now, because more and more developers find they have to do EIRs even in cases where there's no significant environmental impacts, because they're worried that courts are going to find there's a fair argument that you needed to do an EIR. But I think I'm hopeful that if our research does what we're hoping it does, and courts start applying more scrutiny to methods like ITE that overpredict traffic, it will be less likely that projects will have significant environmental impacts, right? Because both VMT and LOS are predicated on trip generation. So if you are generating fewer trips, less likely you're going to have a significant environmental impact. So I guess, our hope is if we can reform this piece of it, hopefully that means fewer projects with significant environmental impacts.
I would also say, coming from urban planning, transportation planning, and engineering, people often tell me when I talk about this issue, especially in California, because I've done some work in California, they'll say, well, we don't have to worry about traffic studies. It's all VMT now. And I have to correct them. No, many cities still require traffic studies. It's an additional layer of evaluation. And I do think there's something to reminding people that it's not this or that. It's both right now in a lot of areas. And that complicates and makes it more expensive to consider as well.
Any
Rowan?
other thoughts?
Hi there. So I'm a housing advocate. I have no expertise at all, except that I always like things that enable housing to be approved. But one of the things that has always sort of made me wonder when I'm like comparing it to my own personal experiences is that there'll be, say, a development that includes family housing, and they'll assume like 2 slots per parking. And I know you're talking about traffic, but to the extent that parked cars become traffic, I think it's related. My personal experience in living in townhouse community where family parking, and it's all worked well until the kids grew up, and then they have 4 or 5 cars per unit. And then likewise in a senior development that I was recently trying to advocate for, I think they were assuming one parking spot per apartment. But so many people, if they have two car couples, even if you're seniors. So I'm just wondering if any of your models are sort of, they just, I'm just sitting there as a consumer wanting this to be approved. On the other hand, my personal experience suggests that these parking ratios like don't make sense with my personal experience.
Yeah, and it's hard as well, because you're planning a development for families possibly that you don't even know yet. They're not like they're people that what they're going to want in 20 years, and that's fair too, because families also change. In one area, I was working at just a local area. We were seeing like slight trends in how many people were living in a unit over a longer period of time, and I think that's partly related to cost. People staying home longer rather than moving out, or maybe people not living alone quite as frequently, things like that. In terms of models, I think where I see the most work happening related to parking is in California. And the UC school system, there are quite a few people who are interested in and collecting information related to parking. I also think there are some great examples of more urban examples in Boston, who did a whole right-sized initiative where they started to evaluate for larger developments, which I think it becomes a little bit more easy because you have more wiggle room to use an average, whereas a smaller development with 1 or 2 units, that average can be wildly off depending on which ways the households go.
And I was just going to say, I'm actually glad you brought that up in terms of how many people are living there, because that was the other point I wanted to make, was that what we're seeing is because the housing costs are so great, we're having overcrowding. I mean, I heard of one case where there was 21 people living in a single family home. So, unsurprisingly, there was a lot of, parking on the street, crowding, and so on. And this is where, these overcrowded apartments, when a new development goes in, the neighbors all come out and say, well, we were using that, underutilized parking retail area that you're now going to put housing on. They were using it as overflow parking.
Yeah.
And so those I think that would be like another element of putting into these models the overcrowding issue.
Absolutely. And so one study we did in Portland, which I don't know to what degree the report is public, but I think we provided it to ITE, so they may have incorporated it yet into their data. But we were interested in looking at housing development in urban areas, all of which were fairly close to good transit service. And many of them were smaller units, but often had higher housing ratios or housing people per housing. And we collected the same data that ITE collected, but we also asked questions like, well, okay, you're walking onto the parcel right now, because that's what ITE cares about. They cordon the site and they only care how you get onto the parcel. But we would ask, you're walking here now, but where were you coming from? Did you transit? Did you park? And we found that even though the total vehicle impact of those developments was still a lot less than what IT would have estimated for the similar size buildings, we noticed that for many of them with really low parking rates, including 3 sites with no parking, they were still a vehicle impact. It was just shifted into other areas of the neighborhood. And when you have an area where there's permitted parking, or it's just really expensive to own a car, it can increase that issue. In another study, we asked people what they would do if parking got more difficult at their area. And the one correlation we found that seemed fairly strong was people who got angry about the very idea of it getting more challenging were people who lived in areas without great transit and without other options. So it was just a cost increase. Just the idea of the question was a cost increase. So not a lot of answers there, but the hope there, I think, is that the work that California people are doing, I think there's more and more information available.
Thank you.
Well, Rona's question to me is almost like a chicken or the egg type question, which is, right, this is something we talked about a little bit before. Is parking caused by people's demand, or is it the reverse, right? So for example, if we capped the amount of parking, would that mean that people would have to drive less? And maybe it would be, well, I guess I'm not going to be able to have the 3rd or the 4th car. I'm going to have to find an alternative way of getting to work or getting my kid to school. Right, rather than, oh, we expect all this traffic, so let's build an ocean of parking, and then more people will be induced to drive and park, right? So like, what's the chicken and what's the egg? And I'm sure Christy can say more about this, but like, for example, in Washington, D.C., we know there was an example where they actually set the parking or the trip rates based on the amount of parking that was actually available, on the assumption that, well, this is the maximum amount of people who will be able to drive because the parking is so limited.
Right.
Of course, in DC, there is very widely available transit, so it's plausible to think if parking isn't readily available, people will ride the train. That, I mean, in my view, is the world I'd like to see us move towards, rather than one, well, we just have to keep adding more and more and more parking, and then more and more and more people will just keep coming. Like I said, it's this perpetual motion thing. So,
but the train has to be there. Like,
right.
That people would get upset when there wasn't a train. There was a train. The response was often, well, I might drive less or give up a car or take transit more. Like, they came up with ideas, absolutely. And then in areas, people living in areas that were really already dense and built out and parking was hard, they're like, them's the breaks. That's what happens when you want to live downtown. But you bring up DC, and I think DC is a great example because they endeavored to collect a ton of data like 10 years ago about housing and hotels because of Congress and everything. Hotels are also a big challenge there. And one of the things that came out of that data collection was first local rates that were not surprisingly much lower than ITE's, multimodal data. So they had a much better sense of how people currently were traveling so that they could estimate that in other places. And they had better parking rates so that they could actually go to developers of housing and say, okay, you're right next to a metro line. Here's what we know from other locations in the area. And I think the way that they've set up their parking requirements, they're not minimums or maximums. They're just sort of, here's where we start based on your land use type and the data that we have locally. And I think that's a really great example of a type of innovation that can make it much more reasonable for the city that you currently live in and that you're planning to be living in.
Thank you.
Christy, the organization that undertook all that data collection, was it the MPO for DC?
So DC is in a unique position because it's a city state. That also means that they operate differently and it's easier for them to get things started. But they have it was DC DOT, And they had a data collection, and that data, as well as other information, went into improving a lot of their different models. They pulled in a lot of data, and you can look up their guidelines to see where the types of information that they pulled into how they approach their guidelines.
I was just wondering if this might be something we could ask from SCAG to, function as a, we need better data, right? You want us to reduce vehicle miles traveled, help us get better data.
Yeah, and I think
we have-
SCAG has done a lot of work. So having them be more of an engaged partner, I think, is useful.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we need to invite them to come speak and publish it to this list. We had a question in the chat. Are there any assembly bills or Senate bills that you have seen projects use that have helped them bypass some of the requirements of CEQA and VMT? You can check out in February, we did a webinar about 2097, which exempts parking for developments that are within a half mile of high quality transit. It was carried by, I think, Laura Friedman from LA, and it passed not this year, but last year, so 2022. I know that has been the one that got the most kind of, I don't know, fanfare. I'll say that. Is anyone else, but I'll put the question out to our panelists, but also if anybody else out there knows of anything other than AB 2097.
Yeah, I'll just kind of put on my other hat as a land use lawyer for a minute on this one. If your project is going to have very significant traffic impacts, it's going to be hard to get any kind of CEQA exemption. Your best bets would be, if it's a smaller project like 10 units, cities now have the ability under SB 10 to declare it CEQA exempt. Otherwise, you can use SB 35, which is a new law that gives a ministerial process and a CEQA exemption, but it's difficult to use because there's certain affordability requirements as well as labor requirements for the use of union labor. So those can be difficult. That can be difficult to take advantage of. Other than that, you have your basic CEQA exemptions, like the infill exemption could potentially be used. But again, it's going to be difficult if the project has really significant significant traffic impacts. But those are the things to kind of look at.
Elizabeth, you mentioned you like to sort of wrap things up with a call to action. Should we maybe talk?
Well, yeah, I was really hopeful that we would get, we wouldn't have a situation where, we blow it up and then we have nothing better to replace it with. I mean, that always, as the longer I've done this work, the more I've been willing to kind of, we talk about the perfect being the enemy of the good.
Right.
I'm now to the point where sometimes I want the housing delivered. Good enough is good enough, right? Like my standard, maybe even a little lower. So yeah, I think if you could, clarify for us, what in your view, what would be the best outcome to make traffic studies, less of a something for NIMBYs to use against new housing development. What would that look like, and how do we carry that message?
Ken, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think we've focused a lot on courts in the paper, but courts really are a secondary. We need state legislatures and departments of transportation to really take the lead here in investing resources and trying to develop methods that can be a plausible substitute for ITE, so that courts aren't placed in the position where they throw out ITE and there's nothing to replace it with. So I think we really should be putting some pressure on the legislature to invest resources in trying to improve the methodology. What I think can also be done is, in many places, there are prescribed kind of traffic estimates and like incentives. Certain types of development, like new urbanist style development that are presumed to have less traffic, get prescribed a automatic sort of off the rack trip estimate that's kind of lower than what ITE would do. It's kind of like a nice reward for doing a smart growth type project. Absent that, smart growth projects are going to be stuck having to do all of this stuff, and their LOS numbers are going to be even higher than a traditional suburban development because they have all kinds of traffic calming things that make congestion worse. But those are the kinds of developments we should want. So I think, activists should be thinking about trying to lobby the legislature to invest real resources in coming up with either alternative methods for predicting traffic impacts or substitutes for predictions. Like I said, these off-the-rack things where we're just going to say, okay, because this is a new urbanist style development, we're not going to make you do a traffic study, right? And kind of give you an incentive to do what we consider to be more desirable forms of development.
Yeah, and to add, I don't think, so we talked a lot about ITE, but also used frequently in traffic studies is the concept of level of service, which is defined in the Highway Capacity Manual. If ITE is an institution that's slow to change, the Highway Capacity Manual is also. So I don't really see industry changing all that quickly, but I do think that where there's motivation and interest, I think a lot can be said for advocating for just more resources put in to developing better data, better assumptions to address this. There are lots of examples in California in general because of housing and because of the faculty that are doing a lot of work throughout the state. But I also think there are opportunities that we haven't taken advantage of. The federal government has a pooled fund study opportunity, which requires a state DOT to be a lead on, which could develop a multi-year data collection program, which maybe starts with housing, but extends to other land uses as, as they seem relevant. The data is not that complicated to collect. We've trained people of all different backgrounds and expertise to collect the data, but it is expensive. So thinking through those sort of strategies where advocating to the state, to the region, to really invest in that, especially for housing. But I would also say affordable retail for small business is also a concern of mine, at least. So I would also encourage and demand that we invest in better data if we're going to use these methods so frequently for every development that's going through.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I took notes, so I've got it written down. Does anybody else have any other questions? We have a couple minutes till the top of the hour.
Hi, I'm Antoine Lay. I'm listening in here, and my background is transportation, and I'm forming a group to do a spectrum of housing typologies here in Orange County.
Oh,
So I've been listening to you, and I think that there's a lot of interest on my part for follow-up and engaging very specific issues. I live in the back of the Westminster Boulevard corridor. You may know that. You're from Orange County, and it traverses through the city of Westminster. And a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, it was declared a mixed-use zone in which they want to put housing as priority. But if you look at the process as historical, you don't know how the city and developers and the industry is ever going to get from where it is now of strip malls to their vision of mixed use. And so we are building a pipeline of a number of projects in which we will test these issues. And we are struggling with those issues ourselves in terms of, parking space and mobility and what is a market and what is the client, the tenant's expectations, and how do we go about doing this under the new laws, which is very favorable towards housing. But I think the engineering community has a lot of capacity to do modeling, particularly nowadays when you're talking about Starbucks. A lot of this are kind of drive-through establishments now, and you're talking about mobility on demand and so on. But the bottleneck, I think, is in the cities, as you say, Ken, the tools that they have and the tendency to not, shake the boat and unable to get away from old habits. So it requires a very creative process of both education, advocacy on our part, for ourselves and for the industry, and be able to take on the small projects that will be defining and pivot us into something that's more balanced in the way that we see development. And that's not an easy process, but it takes that kind of thing, because it's not in the developer industry. They tend to go for the lowest hanging fruit, and this complicates it for them. But I think the alignment is correct in terms of policies, regulations, the measurement tools, the demand for housing is such that we have to be engaged right at the front here at the battle of this issue. So I would be very interested in the things I heard today about possibly follow-on studies and grants in which we can build some kind of that knowledge base to be able to inform and advocate rather than going through the courts. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate that, Antoine, and we're delighted to talk with you, especially about Westminster, where I'm very interested in learning more about. One of the points we're making in the paper is, although all of these players are married to the status quo, they may be dragged into change, because change is happening, not only with the state legislation, as you talked about, but like I said, this Sheets case could be a really big deal, with the Supreme Court itself saying agencies have to do better in predicting traffic impacts. And so we can say, well, we don't really have anything better, but we're going to be expected to do better. And so this work is going to have to be done one way or the other.
And when is the timeline for getting a decision on the Sheets case?
It'll probably be by the summer.
Okay. So we'll
if
know.
you're somebody who watches the Supreme Court, it's a very good bet that they're going to rule that these legislative type exactions have to follow the nexus and proportionality test.
And what case laid down the nexus and proportionality test?
Well, there were three cases: Nolan versus the California Coastal Commission, Dolan versus the city of Tigard, and Kuntz versus the St. Johns River Water Management Company are the three big cases prior to the Sheets one. Yeah.
And
Awesome.
if they were to rule that, does that mean that most cities would press a pause on exactions until they figure out whether they've met the standards?
Well, it probably means that some nexus consultants are going to be making a ton of money, because all of these cities are going to have to come up with nexus studies to justify their legislative exactions that they never had to justify before, and they don't want to have to get rid of them. So they're just going to come up with all these nexus studies. The question's going to be, a lot of them are going to be shoddy. We know that these nexus studies tend to be shoddy. And so are the courts, in light of the mandate that's likely to come from the Supreme Court, going to just continue accepting a bunch of, kind of methodologically suspect nexus studies?
I was going to say hocus pocus, but I think yours is better.